roar of its engine growing louder, the rails vibrating violently beneath her body, the metallic screech of wheels somewhere far down the line as the massive machine thundered closer, her mind flashing through memories of her childhood, her parents, the article she had been about to publish exposing everything she had discovered, and a single desperate thought repeating over and over that she didn't want to die here alone. But suddenly, another sound cut through the wind, faint at first, but unmistakable. Boots pounding across the desert, voices shouting commands, and Emily lifted her head just enough to see silhouettes running toward her against the orange glow of sunset. 6 men moving with unbelievable speed across the sand. And at the same moment, Marcus Hale saw her too, tied to the track exactly where the caller had said she'd be. The train horn blasting again now, maybe 2 miles away, its headlights just beginning to appear as twin specks of white on the horizon. Marcus dropped to one knee beside Emily, pulling the gag from her mouth as another seal began slicing through the ropes with a hardened blade. "You're safe," Marcus said calmly, even though the ground beneath them shook harder every second. But the rope around Emily's ankle had been pulled too tight against the steel rail, and the blade struggled to cut through the thick fibers. The train's headlights growing brighter now, the roar of the engine filling the desert air like an approaching storm, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed they might not make it in time, but Marcus grabbed the rope with both hands, bracing his boot against the rail and pulling with every ounce of strength in his body until the fibers snapped apart just seconds before the train burst around the bend less than 200 yards away, the seals dragging Emily off the tracks and diving into the gravel as the freight train thundered past with a deafening roar, wind blasting dust and sand into the air as hundreds of steel wheels screamed across the rails where she had been tied moments earlier. And when the train finally passed and silence returned, Emily lay shaking in the gravel, staring at the sky, barely able to process that she was still alive. But the story wasn't over yet, because Marcus knew something the criminals didn't realize. If they had gone to the trouble of staging such a brutal execution, it meant Emily's investigation had uncovered something far bigger than anyone suspected. And as the seals helped her to her feet, she whispered the name of the company at the center of everything, a name that made Marcus's expression darken immediately, because it was the same contractor his unit had been quietly investigating for months in connection with illegal arms shipments overseas, and suddenly, the attempted murder on a lonely railroad track became the missing piece of a much larger puzzle, one that would lead to raids, arrests, and a chain of events exposing a criminal network stretching from corporate boardrooms to black market weapon dealers across 3 continents. And weeks later, when the story finally broke on national television, Emily stood beside Marcus outside a courthouse packed with reporters, explaining how close she had come to dying and how a team of Navy SEALs had outrun a train to save her life. But the greatest twist came when investigators revealed the identity of the man who ordered her death, a respected executive whose smiling face had appeared in countless patriotic advertisements about supporting American troops, a man who had built his reputation on loyalty and honor while secretly selling military technology to the highest bidder. And as he was led away in handcuffs, Emily realized the truth she had nearly died to prove had finally come to light, not because she was fearless, but because, when evil believed it had already won, a handful of warriors chose to run toward danger instead of away from it, proving that sometimes justice arrives in the final seconds before disaster, moving faster than fear, faster than lies, and on that evening in the desert, faster than a train. The ground trembling beneath you, the distant horn of a train getting louder every second, and the people who did it are already walking away, confident no one will reach you in time. But what they didn't know, what they never expected, is that somewhere nearby, a group of Navy SEALs had just heard the call. And when Navy SEALs move, they move faster than fear, faster than panic, and sometimes faster than a train. If you love intense stories about courage, justice, and unbelievable last-second rescues, hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next story that proves heroes still exist. Now take a deep breath, because this one will keep your heart racing until the very end. The sun was sinking low over the desert plains outside the small Arizona town of Red Mesa, casting long shadows across the lonely railroad tracks that cut through miles of empty land. and the only sound for miles was the metallic creak of rails cooling in the evening air and the distant hum of insects rising from the scrub brush. But that quiet was about to be shattered by something far darker than anyone in town could imagine, because 30 yards from the track, a black SUV sat half-hidden, behind a cluster of desert mesquite trees, and beside it stood three men watching a woman struggle against thick ropes that bound her wrists and ankles to the steel rails themselves, her cheek pressed against the hot metal, her breathing fast and ragged as panic tightened around her chest like a vice. Her name was Emily Carter, a journalist who had spent the last 6 months digging into a story most people would have been too afraid to touch, a story about missing defense funds, corrupt contractors, and a network of criminals who believed money and power could hide any crime. But Emily had been stubborn and relentless, following paper trails, interviewing frightened witnesses, pushing deeper until she uncovered something that connected powerful businessmen to weapon shipments that were never meant to exist. And when she got too close to the truth, someone decided she had to disappear permanently. And now the men standing over her believed they had chosen the perfect way to make it happen. An accident that would leave nothing behind except twisted metal and a tragic headline about a woman who wandered onto the tracks at the wrong time. One of the men checked his watch and smirked as he heard the distant horn of a freight train miles away, its echo rolling across the desert like thunder. 30 minutes, he said calmly, crouching beside Emily and gripping her hair so she had to look at him. That's how long you've got to think about all the questions you shouldn't have asked. Emily tried to speak, but the gag in her mouth muffled the words into desperate sounds, her mind racing through every possibility of escape, every tiny movement of her wrists against the rope, every shallow breath as the rails vibrated faintly beneath her cheek. But the knots were tight, and the men had done this before. They knew how to tie someone down, so there was no chance of getting free. And after a few more seconds, the men climbed back into the SUV, its engine roaring to life, before it disappeared in a cloud of dust down a narrow dirt road, leaving Emily alone with the wind, the fading sunlight, and the slowly approaching train, miles away at first, but coming closer with every passing second. And for a moment, the world seemed impossibly silent, except for the faint vibration beneath her cheek and the pounding of her own heart. But far beyond the horizon, something else had already begun moving, something the men in that SUV had not planned for, because 40 miles away at a remote training compound tucked into the mountains, a group of Navy SEALs had just finished a brutal endurance exercise when one of the communications officers sprinted across the yard holding a phone in his hand, shouting for Lieutenant Marcus Hale, a veteran SEAL with sharp eyes and the kind of calm presence that made other soldiers trust him instantly. Marcus grabbed the phone. County explained that a terrified truck driver had just called in, a strange sight he'd spotted through binoculars while parked on a ridge overlooking the rail line. A woman tied to the tracks and a train scheduled to pass through within the hour. The sheriff's department was scrambling, but the closest patrol car was 20 minutes away, and the train was moving faster than expected. Marcus didn't hesitate. Within seconds, he turned to the SEALs around him and said only 3 words, "We move now." And what happened next looked less like a rescue and more like a storm coming to life. Vehicles roared to life. Gear was grabbed on the run. And within minutes, 2 off-road trucks blasted down the mountain road toward the desert plain, where Emily lay struggling against the ropes, unaware that help was racing toward her, unaware that the rails beneath her cheek were already beginning to hum louder as the train closed the distance, the ground vibrating harder now, each tremor sending spikes of fear through her chest as she twisted her wrists desperately, the ropes burning her skin but refusing to give way, tears sliding down the dust on her face as the sound of the train horn echoed again, much closer this time, a deep, haunting blast that made the desert air tremble. And somewhere beyond the horizon, 2 SEAL trucks hit the dirt road at nearly 70 miles an hour, suspension slamming against rocks and ruts as Marcus Hale studied a GPS screen showing the rail line ahead, calculating distances with the kind of precision drilled into him through years of combat missions. The train would arrive in 9 minutes, maybe less if it accelerated through the straightaway, and the dirt road twisted through rough terrain that would slow them down. But Marcus had already decided they weren't taking the road all the way. 5 minutes later, the truck skidded to a halt beside a steep ravine, and the SEALs jumped out, grabbing cutting tools and sprinting across open desert toward the rails visible in the distance. the sun dipping lower as shadows stretched across the sand, and Emily could hear the train clearly now, the roar of its engine growing louder. The rails,